Welcome to a special and rather different My Jericho. A year ago, a stranger came up to me at a My Jericho event in St Barnabas Church and said he wanted to do a talk on the history of the Radcliffe Infirmary, the RI. I knew how important that had been to Jericho and to Oxford. In its prime, the RI occupied a massive site between the Woodstock Road and Walton Street. It was the community hospital far and wide. Of course I agreed. I then midwifed Ian Baxter, former RI medical social worker turned train buff and train company executive, to deliver it. He has done that in spades. Ian found the venue, St Luke's Chapel, in the midst of the old site, got it for free, supplied the wine, and delivered this cracking, well-researched, very personal lecture. Over to him.
Well, thank you very much, John, and a very warm welcome to you all here this evening. I hope you can all hear me. I'm a railwayman, so I do intend to shout loudly at railway stations. So I expect you to be able to hear. And I'll try and stand over here and not block the view of the slides. I don't use many words in slides. I use pictures and images. And I think that's the core topic of this evening. So I hope you all enjoy it. I'm imagining there are a number of people here who worked as a Radcliffe Infirmary. I certainly did, and I'm just going through in a moment or two, taking you through some of my experiences that led me from being a young 21-year-old in the hospital as a patient many years ago to standing here this evening. And then I'm going to reflect a little bit on the history of the Radcliffe, but this is not a history lecture, nor is it an architecture lecture, although the architecture and the history are both interesting. And then towards the end, I want to, in celebrating the Radcliffe Observatory Quarters regeneration, and as John has referred to, the Schwarzman Centre being the completion of that in many ways, I then also want to think about further ways in which we might be able to remember the hospital. And I want to argue this evening that it's important that we do. I think the first thing to say is that it's a place. Again, it's not just a history and architecture, it's a place. It's a place where people were born, people were healed, people died, and many people worked often for long periods of their lives and gave a lot to it. Now, those of you in the audience who are railway people, and I recognise one or two of them, will be unsurprised if we don't quite get away with no railway pictures in the presentation. I normally talk about railways a lot because that's my professional job in the railway industry. But just to give you a flavour of place, this was a place called Banbury South Signal Box in the north of Oxfordshire. And along with a signal box at the north of Banbury Station, for over 100 years, it controlled trains, and it had a lot of men largely, but some women who worked in it as signallers, and they loved these places. They were full of polish and levers, and they were beautiful. And that's me actually in a demonstration in Banbury North Signal Box just before it was demolished. And when they were demolished, in a sense, it took away a whole place, a place of being, a place of work, a place of history. And to some extent, when I came back to Oxford in 2016, I'd lived in Shropshire 15 years after living in Oxfordshire for more than 20 years. I came back and knew that the Radcliffe Infirmary, most of the Radcliffe that I understood had been demolished. And it was a place that had gone in the way that it had been. And I suspect, again, that place was probably very important to some of you over your working lives or your lives here in Oxford. And indeed, when it closed in 2007, there were some of those people, probably technically illegally trusted, who went around the Radcliffe and put photographs on the web and all the places that they'd seen. And I think this is a touching image from 2007. Goodbye, RI. It's a sad occasion that a place as important as the Radcliffe Infirmary comes to its end. So this is a My Jericho evening. I'm glad my daughter is here, and she helped me last night to think about how I presented some of this. And said, well, it's My Jericho, for those of us who live in and around this part of Oxford. And it's my Radcliffe Infirmary as the first start that I just want to give to you. And I was an undergraduate at Keble College back in, well, I think it feels like 1485, but it was actually 1976. So I was studying history, so it had nothing to do with healthcare, nothing at all about hospitals. But this place, when you were at Keble, you could hear the ambulances come in and out. You could see the doctors, you could see the nurses, the fuss of this place that was the main healthcare place in Oxfordshire and a world-class place at that. It spoke to you, you knew it was here. But probably, I really, along with other fellow students, we used the corridor, especially in the winter, to go to Jericho and go out through Walton Street, and you can imagine where we ended up, in pubs. And I just put it at Hartwood Arms because that's one of my favourite pubs in Jericho. There are many brilliant ones, but it's still a pub that you can go and talk to each other in. It isn't dominated by loud music, and it isn't a restaurant either. But I just want to go back and reflect on the corridor for a minute, because although that's at the end, whoever photographed that was when it had come to the end of its life. I remember working in a Baxter over many years. The corridor was a place that we all talked, staff talked to each other, maybe very quietly, but it was a place where you easily engaged with each other. When I worked at the John Radcliffe, and we were in the lift, my offices were up at level 7. In the lift, what do we British do? Yes, we do not talk. And the Radcliffe was a social place. I remember it very much in that way. So, in 1979, some of you may remember the wonderful series of Porridge, Fanny Barker and Richard Beckinsale. And I was in my third year at Keble, and I was doing all my revision for university. And at the end of March, Richard Beckinsale suddenly died, just like that, aged 31. And I was 21. But I was becoming aware at that time, as I was going up to the upper reading room of the library to do my revision, that despite the shallow staircases, I couldn't get up those stairs anymore. I was really struggling. And I thought, my goodness, am I going to be like Richard Beckinsale? Am I finished? Is my life coming to an end? And a lot of this evening is about people. I'm sure you have got, those of you who worked in the hospital or experienced it, hundreds of stories of people. These are just some impressions of mine. And the first person wasn't actually in the Radcliffe Infirmary, but he was the Keble College GP at 27 Beaumont Street, Dr. J.M. Stewart, who was an Irishman. I only ever met him once. He had a medical student with him, and I go in there pretty terrified. And he gets his medical student to sort of tap out my chest and find out what's wrong. And he then said in his gentle Irish accent, "Well, I think my student has diagnosed the problem. I think you have what's called a spontaneous pneumothorax, which means a collapsed lung." And then he reassured me and said, "Lots of tall and then slender young men tend to suffer from this. So don't worry too much." He said, "What I suggest you do, Ian, is take a very gentle stroll now, go around the corner, up St. Giles, and go to the Radcliffe Infirmary." And this was another world as well. He said that they will know you are coming by the time you get there, because I will have rung them and told them. So I get there, and this time I do notice the Radcliffe Infirmary a bit more than I would have done as a student never seeing it at all. And there was the sign, and you went down what was a fairly grim and narrow little pathway towards what was the accident department. Well, if you look at that now and compare that to the John Radcliffe, and the sheer scale of the John Radcliffe, it's difficult to imagine, isn't it, that here in this hospital, the whole of really Oxford and a lot of Oxfordshire's emergency services were provided. And I, nowadays, when I cycle, I always cycle down through the Radcliffe to go home to Binsey. And I always cycle down that bit. And I always think this is where the start of saving my life happened. And that's what it looks like today. It's the primary care department. Those new gates that have gone up recently, of which more in a bit, and very started flats with Somerville accommodation at the bottom. And I just want to mention by name two people who I think led the teams that mean I'm here. And one was the consultant physician here at the Radcliffe Infirmary, Dr. Brian Bigden, in the Department of Medicine. I cannot find a photograph of him anywhere at the moment, otherwise I would have put one of those up. And Brian Bigden was the physician who got me through the period until it became clear that I needed an operation. And I had an operation by Mr. Alf Gunning at the Churchill Hospital, who was a remarkable gentleman. He was South African, didn't look like a standard consultant, not that I think there is a standard consultant. He was the man who, he's dead now, but his hands are on me and my lung is working. It's the magic of his healing powers. You're an interesting man. Some of you may have heard the story that because he didn't look like the standard consultant, he once went into his ward and there was a nurse running the ward who hadn't met him before. And she said to him, good, you've arrived. The sink that needs repairing is in the So he went round and repaired the sink and came back out to him and said, staff nurse, I've now repaired the sink. May I now see my patients? Now, whilst Alf Gunning was healing me at the Churchill in that April and then May of 1979, that was when this hospital came to an end as the main accident and emergency hospital and acute hospital in that totality and moved to the John Radcliffe. And that's a wonderful photograph from the Oxford Mail of a young student nurse, Helen Westley, who must now be about my age, I imagine, closing the doors in the Radcliffe Infirmary. That seems to me quite a powerful moment of the shift and change. And as many of you know, the hospital went on to 2007, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But I think that was a seminal moment at which the Radcliffe Infirmary's purpose changed in a significant way. And it moved to the John Radcliffe Hospital. I rather like that artist's, a very classic 1970s style imagery, isn't it? And I think it does give that strong picture of the optimism and the expansion that was provided by virtue of John Radcliffe Hospital. And just finally, that was, this is another person, apparently. This is me in about 1981, because after I did my degree, I was so taken by having experienced this hospital that I came and worked as a nursing auxiliary there. And for those of you who are nurses, you will all know that actually being engaged in direct personal care of people is a tender, an intimate thing, and sometimes a very difficult thing. And there was I, a little lad really, didn't know anything much about anything. And it really taught me a lot. I worked here for a year, I worked at the John Radcliffe for a year, and then when I was doing my social work course, two of my tutors for my social work course are here, which is lovely. I also worked here at the Radcliffe every Saturday morning and worked sent to every which ward there was. I later became a qualified social worker, and look at the fashions and the styles. That's about 1987, 88. And that's the social work department in geriatric medicine here at the Radcliffe Infirmary. So it was a very meaningful place to me. And I think it was my daughter last night to help me understand that why I stood here is because of that experience. So I am, however, going to give you a little bit of history, especially for any of those of you who may not know the detail of Radcliffe. It actually opened on the 18th of October, 1770. So I was kind of kicking myself and saying we should have done this on Tuesday, because that's 252 years ago. But, you know, it's interesting to think, isn't it? That building over there opened, you can kind of almost touch it by knowing the date that it happened on. And, you know, it's not, again, a history lesson about John Radcliffe, but he was the physician to Queen Anne. He was a student at University College, and he was a fellow at Lincoln. And when he died, the Radcliffe Trust was established and founded, and it not only funded the Radcliffe Infirmary, but the Radcliffe camera, observatory, and it continues to be an active charity in the world now in a very positive way. And this is seeing the Roman god of medicine, I can't get the word right, and John Radcliffe. This is from the Oxford University Almanac from 1760. So in other words, in advance of the opening of the hospital. And this is, in a sense, an ethical statement about what the hospital was meant to be doing. And indeed, there was a chap called Joseph Broomhead, MA, Queen's College, the Queen's College, I think, who wrote this pamphlet, An Oration on the Utility of Public Infirmaries, in 1772, after the Radcliffe opened. And it says, occasioned by the opening of the Radcliffe Infirmary. And I think it's interesting the way, as you can see, he talks about ethical matters for why these infirmaries are important. Of all the social qualities, benevolence is the most immediately useful, and naturally induces that great end and cemented society, mutual beneficence. He was only 24, and actually, when you read the oration, it might be quite dangerously radical stuff, actually. I was a bit surprised that he was allowed to even publish it. It might be dangerously radical today, actually. So do read it and find it in there. He went on to become a vicar, by the way, in Dutch. And in a sense, it mirrors, I think, that other underpinning, I suspect, of those people who worked on this, and certainly me, the ethics and values of the National Health Service in particular. And I think, 1948, it will provide you with all the care that you need. Every restriction or man, woman or child can use it or any parts of it. We know that there are big challenges now about affordability of that and about how that's distributed. But I think the principle remains strong, and it's a principle absolutely central to all of society's expectations for healthcare in this country. And the Radcliffe was, of course, part of that. In 1948, the Radcliffe ceased to be a voluntary hospital and became part of the United Oxford Hospitals until the foundation of the health authorities in the 1970s. So there it was completed, and that's the 1837 engraving, which many of you might have seen with St. Giles Church, just on the left there. And it gives that impression, does it not, of a beautiful, grand place in a rural setting. It's almost like a country house. Well, indeed it was. If you look at this 1834 engraving of Oxford as a whole, and I'm going to zoom in on it in a minute for you, they didn't have drones then, by the way, so I'm not quite sure how they managed to get this right, but they did. And the Radcliffe and the Radcliffe Observatory were right up there, far away at the edge of the city. And as you get closer, you can see the University Press here on the left, what is now Freud's here on Walton Street, and you can see the observatory and the infirmary and St. Giles Church was there. So it was very much on the edge of the city, and I'm told that if you look at the history, you even see that highwaymen were still prevalent on Woodstock Road, I think which was called Birmingham Road originally, on Woodstock Road in the 19th century. So, remarkable when you think about that. So that was the place of the Radcliffe in that rural setting. And just to reflect on that once more, about 3 or 4 years ago, I had some massive knee problem one night, and I couldn't move. I couldn't walk, I couldn't cycle, and I couldn't drive. So I had to get a taxi to take me up to the John Radcliffe Hospital. And the taxi driver was really nice, lived in Oxford all his life, and he was bemoaning the traffic problems around the John Radcliffe. And for anyone in Oxford, we all know the traffic problems around the John Radcliffe are massive. And he said they should have built it further out in the countryside, on the other side of the A45 once. And I said, well, the Radcliffe Infirmary was in the countryside when they built it. When they built the John Radcliffe, it was in the countryside. And it's only now that we're finding that development is going on outside the A40 as well. So the world changes in many of the same ways. But it is an elegant building, is it not? And I think at the moment, I have to say, Oxford University has brilliantly restored it. And by the way, the university has kindly provided this meeting room tonight free to us. So a very big thank you to the University of Oxford for that. An elegant building, you can begin to see in this mid-19th century engraving that it's becoming slightly more urbanised. There's more buildings around the hospital. When you then see this lovely, again, mid-19th century photograph, or the early photographs of it, you see the strength of this building, the quality of its position. In a way, that oration on the value of infirmaries also argues that the public quality of the buildings also expresses the importance of the buildings to the society and culture in which they exist. The architect was a man called Smith Ledbetter, and he sadly died before the Radcliffe Infirmary was completed, and one of his associates had to complete it. But he'd originally been the contractor for the Gloucester Royal Infirmary, which had opened 15 years before, in 1755. And so he hadn't designed it. I think you can probably see there, can't you, that when he got to the Radcliffe, I think he created something a bit finer. And I think the Radcliffe is beautiful in its proportions and its quality. Of course, in this photograph with St. Luke's Chapel, within which we're sat. Triton, the fountain, was created in 1857 by someone called John Bell. You can even find a catalogue of it nowadays. You can get a catalogue of it off the internet, printed in America, and I found the manufacturer's catalogue there, a grand edition. This chapel was completed in 1864 with its beautiful and amazing stained glass windows. We can't see because it's dark, although we can see that one behind. And its architect was Arthur W. Blomfield. I, in the railway, do remembrance services every year. We do them at Birmingham Moor Street and Leamington Spa. I used to work for Chiltern Railways and was very much part of the team that brought your railway from Maryland to Oxford, actually. But we do those remembrance services, and each time we read out some of the names of the people who died in the First World War who worked for the Great Western Railway all over the western part of England. And I always think if you name something, it brings them alive again, even if only for the time you're talking about them. So, I think that of all the people who have passed on, who I'm talking about in this presentation scene. So I now want to just move to the second part of the talk, which is about people. And again, this is impressions, ladies and gentlemen. These are just some people who illustrate some of the qualities in my mind of the Radcliffe Infirmary and the community that it was right here in the middle of Oxford. The first one is Dr. Howard Lowry. Although he was at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology, the fact that penicillin was first used here in 1941 in a clinical form is really important history. And I think the Oxford team, with him and Ernest Chain and Norman Heatley, has been neglected in understanding the powerful role they played in penicillin's creation. We always think of Fleming and discovered it, and rightly think of him, that the Oxford team played a central part in the use of penicillin. Even if we're now in a position where, as a layperson, I hear medical people concerned as to whether penicillin is going to, antibiotics are going to be enough in the current world. Second person I want to talk about is some people who worked here will know this. There was a Cronshaw Award here at the Radcliffe Infirmary, but this was Canon George Cronshaw, who was the treasurer of the Radcliffe Infirmary 1910 to 1928, and the treasurer was the chief executive, in fact. And he also, in the very last part of his life, became principal of St. Edmund Hall. He died within 3 months of doing that, which was very sad. But he was a remarkable man. He understood that the site here at Radcliffe was not going to be big enough for the long-term future. That's an image of the hospital in the post-1979 period. Those of you who may have worked here before will remember the 4 hutted wards that were here. In fact, I was admitted to one of them. But you can see here with the Radcliffe Observatory here and the main infirmary building where we are here, just how the totality of the site and the observatories around as well had been filled up right up as far as it could go, really, with hospital services. It was full. And partly, again, that image to me illustrates the buzz that was here. There were so many people working here, so much going on, so many people being healed, so many people being born, and sadly, so many people dying here as well. And it was a profound place. But Cronshaw was the man who then looked at the manor house up in Headington, which is that drawing there, and thought, well, that is our expansion location. And I don't know if you know how much it cost for the Radcliffe Infirmary to buy it. In 1919, it cost £16,000, which is difficult to credit, is it not? And when you look at the John Radcliffe and you see its sheer scale of it, you can see why it couldn't fit here. It couldn't fit here. And the John Radcliffe is an amazing place. But it is in a different place. It's not in the city in quite the same way this was. And he was described as a man having amazing courage and energy, that enabled him to save the Radcliffe Infirmary in the 1920s from falling into being a second-rate type of hospital, because he was so clear about its growth requirements. The second person I want to mention, and I don't know his surname, Dr. Hoffaday was here, Malin, I don't know, because Dr. Hoffaday and I worked in the same wards. I worked for his team as his social work team. I was one of the domestic managers on the specialist medical unit, which was the diabetic and endocrinology ward here, and I was the nursing auxiliary. And Elsie was one of these type of women who were employed in the 1950s and 1960s to look after the meals, the cleanliness, everything in the ward. And what I remember Elsie, who I remember being about this high, was that you didn't mess with her, obviously. She was tough as anything. Patients all respected her. She absolutely adored and worshipped the ward sister and was a real, honoured her in a great, powerful way. And she knew what the diets were about. So when the medical staff and the nursing staff were talking about diets, she wasn't blindly carrying out instructions. She knew what was right and wrong. She couldn't be fooled by the patients. And I think she was a remarkable person. When I was working here, was the time in the 80s where the domestic service was privatised. And I think, without being political about it, I think there was a big loss then. Because what happened was a lot of these women who worked here for 20, 30, 40 years left and retired. And we have lots of young people who came in with shorter jobs, and they tried very hard, but I never noticed them quite able to get that strength and quality and depth of knowledge and understanding that these women had. The third person I want to mention is Dr. Walner. He was a geriatrician, and I worked in his department for 3 or 4 years. I was a social worker, just at the time in community care. This is Dr. Walner here. And he was a remarkable and humane man. And he'd been on the kinder transport before the Second World War, which more in a moment. And what I remember of Dr. Walner was one day we were walking down the corridor in the Baxter, and some very angry patients' relatives came up. And they sort of were saying, you should be doing this test, that test, the other test on our father. You're neglecting him. And Dr. Walner said, look, let's go to my office. He asked me to go along with him, so I did. And he firmly but gently said, I'm very sorry, your father is going to die. And none of the tests that you propose will solve that fact. Indeed, all they'll be is uncomfortable and unpleasant for him. So we are not going to do that to him. We're going to look after him with kindness and compassion until he dies, and we're going to nurse him properly. And I remember that brought it all down. And Dr. Hockaday and I were having a lunch the other day, and we were talking about Dr. Walner, and it was a wonderful story that there was the ship's captain who was bringing children over from Nazi Germany to Britain was asked one day to bring one load of children on one ship from Hook of Holland to Harwich and then going to New York. And Dr. Woolner was on that ship, but the captain decided not to do that. He went back more times against orders to the Hook of Holland to get more children out. And that was also the origins of Dr. Woolner's persistence in quality and compassionate care. So I know he died a few years ago. I know there's a bench in the University Parks that I like to remember him. He was a great man to work with. And then lastly here, this very elderly lady, this is a picture on the web from her obituary last year. I didn't know she died until I was doing this lecture. This is Anne Ashfield, who was bereavement welfare officer at the John Radcliffe Hospital, and she'd been a telephonist, I think, here at the Radcliffe Infirmary as well. And she was a small Irish woman, again, rather like I was a student. And she was remarkable because she looked after people when their relatives had died, sorted out funeral directors, all the bureaucracy, but she helped them with depth and compassion again. And I remember her saying to me once, Ian, there are any number of patients who die in this hospital every week. Their babies, their mothers, their fathers, their husbands, their wives, their children. And the way I work is that is the only death in the whole world to that family. And I remember her saying that, and I think that so affected all my social work practice. For the sort of next 15 years, I carried on doing that. And it does actually, when I was customer service director at Chiltern Railways for many years as well, that for every passenger, their journey is the only journey. And what you have to try to do is do your best for all of your customers. So I learned a lot around, and she died last year. And I'm hoping that after this, as I found her requiem mass on the web, that I may be able to contact her family in Headington. And I'd like to do that. And as John said, the proceeds, half of your donations this evening, will go to the charity that's got her name at the John Radcliffe Hospital. And I think that sense of loss when you lose a baby must be devastating. I'm glad that her name is associated with supporting that work. Finally, on people, I just want to sort of say you can find a myriad of things on the web. I found this wonderful book of photographs by Wendy Albis, which was about the hospital in its latter days, after it had moved up to the John Radcliffe, what was happening here. And I just love both of those pictures. The studied care here of what this young woman is doing to help this gentleman. And then just behind the scenes, I love the white coat, the way in which there's care for the basics of eating and drinking. Wonderful. So, to our sort of third and final bit. The Radcliffe Observatory Quarter is heading towards completion. And I think that's a great achievement of the University of Oxford. And if you look at it and compare it to, again, the images I did earlier, you can see the sheer scale of work going on. This is the Maths Institute here, and this is where the Chaucer building is, and of course this is now where the Baxter School of Government is. So here for Radcliffe, it's now hosting the Research Centre for the Humanities in the old Infirmary building, along with the Theology and Philosophy Faculty Library. It's hosting the Maths Institute in that splendid building, which I think does set itself up against the observatory very well. There's the primary healthcare department, the Radcliffe Primary Healthcare Building just across the way, in the old outpatients building. There's the Blavatnik School of Government, which is really important in international relations, again about the ethics of government. And we've seen perhaps some failures of ethics of government over the recent years in a number of places. Glad that we've got that here in Oxford to be thinking positively about that. And then there is the Schwartzman Centre, which John noted earlier and has illustrated here, which is now happening. I think when Professor William White of St John's College talked to my Jericho earlier this year, he very ably set out not only its academic purpose, but its social and arts purpose for people here in Oxford. And it's meant to be used by the community. It's not meant to be walled in. I think that's really positive. And for a number of us who live in Jericho, it's also a new Radcliffe House, which is our health centre. and precisely where those hunted wards are. So when I go when I go to have my COVID inoculations, it's where they looked after me with my. So celebration. I just want to finish really with some suggestions about how we might celebrate the Radcliffe Infirmary, the hospital and the culture, community and ethics that it had amidst the Radcliffe Observatory. The Radcliffe Guild of Nurses has already done some of that with its lovely flat that's just on the wall. You see when you go out. And by the way, there's one badge I don't have. I always wear a badge with GWR on it, God's Wonderful Railway, which is online over here. The one badge I don't have, and that's just buy from the internet. I do not have a Radcliffe School of Nursing Qualified Nurses badge, and I kind of wish I did. I kind of wish I'd been able to be a qualified nurse as well. And so I got this off the internet, and I obviously never take it off its backing, so I'm not a nurse, but I'm glad to have it. That was it. And so the Radcliffe Guild of Nurses is a very profoundly positive organisation in looking to celebrate the hospital. But I want to suggest that we probably could, as a community, have friends of the Radcliffe Observatory Quarter. I've avoided showing you some more railway images, which are friends of Livingston Station. When I was at Chiltern Railways, we joined the Civic Society there. We set up Friends of Livingston Station. And they did a huge amount of brilliant work on this rather neglected Art Deco station. But I thought I'd try to keep the slides down a little bit. And there are 2 or 3 areas that I think the community could work on. The first is Triton. Well, that is the replica Triton that's out there that was replicated by the university as part of the quarter, and very splendid it is. But the original, which has also been beautifully conserved, is somewhere else. And we might just say it's just here. And this is God's Wonderful Railway. That's actually what it looks like. And I must admit, when I look at him, the original Triton there, I kind of think he's not there with a fountain of water coming out of him. He's there pushing up, saying, let me out of this box, is. So although he's safely conserved, there's no interpretation, it doesn't say what he is. It's not in a healthcare setting, it bears no relationship to the Radcliffe. That is actually where it is. I can't go over Wall Railroad Bridge without taking photographs of trains. It's a sad reality. But he's roughly just behind here behind this tree. And much as God's Wonderful Railway is great, it's not a place for Triton. I think what I'd like to see is the original Triton in some way celebrates its incredible beauty. When you look at the replica in front of the primary care building, doesn't it look fantastic? It probably can't quite do that because it's not capable of being outside. It needs to be protected. But it strikes me that it could be, and the John Radcliffe Hospital, and Valerie Pepys, who's here, a wonderful artist in Jericho, has done a drawing for me of how it could potentially look at John Radcliffe. Still going to have to be potentially surrounded by some kind of glass. It could go to the Ashmolean. There are lots of wonderful figures that it could be there. It could go to the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology, perhaps, because of the penicillin linkage. It could go in the Schwartzman Centre. It could be inside. People could see it and be closer to it and actually enjoy its art more effectively. So I think that leaving it where it is not the right answer. And I think with a friends group, we could affect change in that. We need to raise money as well. Share cost with the university and others, I suspect. The second item I think we could do something on is the maternity hospital and the gates to Walton Street that used to exist. And again, for those of you who are born in the Radcliffe, have children born in the Radcliffe, or other relatives born in the Radcliffe, this may be particularly important. That was the building that was opened in 1931. That's looking from Walton Street. Around 1930s building, I think, and you can see the gates and the gateway to Walton Street at the bottom. And this was the Queen Mother and Lord Nuffield opening it. And again, you can see when you're getting a bit closer just how splendid those gates are when you look towards Walton Street. This was the design by the steelwork designers. And again, when you get a bit closer to it, something worth having. Don't know if they exist at all. I think in the Radcliffe Infirmary Health Service days, this bit was cut off for some reason, and I remember it just coming to here. But something very beautiful, and that's what it looks like now. And in fact, they just here are the little vases, the vases that were on top of the pillars, are still there. And it strikes me that when the Schwartzman building is completed, that this would be a really important opening up line of sight to the quarter, Walton Street and Jericho again, and something really worth doing. Thirdly is the Bradshaw figures, of which there are three in here, as you see. Going back to the maternity hospital, this was the mother and child that was on the apex of the building. And when it was demolished in part of the quarter regeneration, it brilliantly was saved and secured, and it's now on the extension to the Radcliffe Primary Care building up here. But again, it's not interpreted. Nowhere does it say what it is, why it's there, where it was from, who the artist was, or anything like that. And that feels something that we could, as a Friends Group, support and do something about. And then there were three other ones, and there were ones on the walls here, three of them, you can just see them, which Bradshaw did, and they were on these new nurses' homes that were built in the 1930s. You can see one of them there, and you can see the infirmary, original infirmary behind it, and there's one of them in its original position, and there they are now. And they were created by someone called Lawrence Bradshaw. I didn't know this, I was researching Radcliffe in the last couple of years. He was a lifelong member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. That's him carving the bust of Karl Marx in Highgate Cemetery. He also, for the round, he also did these rather splendid 1930s adverts under police railway. So rather remarkable, and I think there's some more celebration of his artwork that could be done and drawn attention to by the Friends. Four, there are some recollections and recreations. Going back to the young nurse, closed the accident and emergency service in 1979, closed that door. There used to be a sign, a lovely plaque, some of you may remember it, saying in the 1970 bicentenary that this room was formerly Bagot and Drake wards, is the only part of the hospital continuously in use for patients since the war that the hospital opened. And I don't know where it is. It's not at the John Radcliffe in that corridor beyond items. And I hope the estates department have collected it, kept it. If it's found, I think it should go up again. And if it's not found, I think we should recreate it, because I think it's rather beautiful. Then that is a lovely corridor in the John Radcliffe between the original JR2 and the West Wing. And this was one of the benches that used to be in Piccadilly. In the Radcliffe, there was a part of the hospital where the corridor turned round. People would gather in Piccadilly. Together, I think Dr. Papadolo, it was called Carfax at one time as well. And those benches were there, and I remember them, and a number of them, up at the John Radcliffe. And we could recreate them. The Friends of Leamington Station recreated a dozen original Great Western Railway design benches. They look very beautiful. And what do they do as well? They provide room for people to sit down. Rather brilliant stuff. And I think in, say, the Schwartzman Centre, you could imagine having some of these that would speak back to the original hospital. These were the type of benches in the outpatients department over there. And if you look, I rather love that wonderful picture from 1959 of people waiting, seeing how formally everyone was dressed, by the way, as well. And one of those is up there at the John Radcliffe as well. And again, I think that we could do something that's small but meaningful about the history of the hospital. And the last of the minor things, I particularly like this one. It's right outside where accident and emergency was, and it's still there. If you go and walk up it now, you'll find it still there. I could imagine most people doing a project would just assume it was to be thrown away. I like it. I think it's really nice, and I would like to ensure that it is protected and not lost. And then finally, this is more uncertain, and I suspect people might not agree with my thinking remotely on this. But I'm interested in the last bits of the Radcliffe Infirmary from the 20th century period. That's the Harkness building, and behind it is the Gibson building. And the reason I'm interested is that the Gibson building, just behind it, houses the laboratories, houses the theology faculty. When I came back here in 2016, I did a bit of postgraduate work on theology, and I walked into that building in 2016, and I last seen the hospital in 1989, and the smell of the Radcliffe Infirmary hit me like a brick, and I cried. It makes me almost crying, I almost like I did cry. I just didn't realise what I was about to walk into. And it still has the same staircase designs that were in Richard Lower Ward and various other hospitals. And I look at it and I think, well, it might be sort of unremarkable, or might it actually be in a different light? Really quite interesting. So for the final thinking for the university at the Observatory Quarter, I sort of wonder if they may want to think what could be done with these last bits of the infirmary that actually exist, other than the original 18th century building. So that's a very distinct end. Thank you from me. I'm leaving up here just a selection of all the books that there are about the Radcliffe Infirmary. There were just a few. Valerie's paintings are on the front of these ones here, and it's a great selection of books. The moulding Dr. Flory's coat is very splendid from the story of Emerson. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Well, wasn't that a treat? If you'd like to help Ian in his plans to save the history of the RI, then he wants to set up a Friends of the RI group to ensure the original Triton statue finds a decent home and much more. Contact him directly at ian.baxter@slcrail.com. That's ian.baxter@slcrail.com. Meanwhile, keep watching the virtual My Jerichos. All past editions are on YouTube. All are accessed via the website myjericho.co.uk. And if you have a brilliant idea, please share it with me. We'll make it happen.
Yoo-hoo!